Hello everyone, welcome to Petrichor on the Rocks. I'm Mason. Have you optimized your morality today? Do you know what optimizing morality is? Well, Alex O'Connor doesn't seem to. He recently had an interview with Cliff and Stewart, and all throughout the interview he kept falling into the same mental trap, and was to have unoptimized moral thinking. What is unoptimized moral thinking? Well, it's when you get stuck on one end of the extreme of the scale of morality. So let's take a look at the scale of morality right now. It spans from the established on one end all the way to the ideal on the other end, and here in the middle is where you need to be in order to optimize morality. This is the functional in the right now. It's the place where you can actually create morality and have it actually do good in the world. But why stay still on this scale? Surely we're meant to move towards the ideal. So now, why not go right to the ideal for any given moral situation? It's because it's unreachable. It's an ideal, and thus it's still in the realm of fantasy. It's a wonderful fantasy, and it's where we should be trying to get to, but not at the cost of all else. Because if you throw everything you have trying to reach a fantasy, if it turns out that you can't reach that fantasy, then you gave everything you had and are left with nothing. That is the danger of pursuing the ideal. It can destroy everything if you let it. It doesn't matter how nice that ideal is. If the truth is you can't reach it yet, then it's nothing but a trap. If you fall in love with the unreachable fantasy, you're asking for disaster. Similarly, on the other end of the scale, it's also dangerous. It's the established. It's what has worked in the past for moral function. It's tried and true and will never let you down, except that it will absolutely let you down. It worked in the past, which means any change in the future could cause it to be utterly dysfunctional. If you fall in love with that which is established, then you will stagnate and be left behind. That is the danger of too much tradition. Over time, society as a whole has moved forward on the moral scale, getting closer and closer to our ideals. But as we move forward in how close to the moral ideal we're able to get, we inherently leave the past behind, such as the ancient times during which the Old Testament was written. To turn around and look and try to judge it by our current moral place on the scale is to demand that the past be up in the ideal rather than its own place of function. Our functional now is their ideal. If we try to judge the circumstances of those who lived at the time of the writing of the Old Testament books, then we are demanding that they see more than they could possibly see and do more than they could do. It's the same as if you demanded that we resolve all of our modern problems right now. It's a beautiful thought, but it's just not going to happen, and that's exactly what Alex is demanding. Alex seems to want God to just boost mankind right up to the ideal, but if man refuses to seek the ideal and instead chooses to sin and stagnate where he is, then God is only able to do as much good as the evil allows. He cannot force a sin-loving people up into the ideal. Doing so would only blind them. Thus God, in writing the laws that he did, it was to facilitate the most good possible without urging such a high ideal that it destroyed the good. By urging people forward without giving them more than they can handle, God is optimizing morality around the limitation of sin. Alex, you'll see repeatedly throughout this video, wants to jump up to the ideal and say, why did God not act in a more perfect way? And the answer is because perfection, unrealized, is worse than realized results now. That's the balanced, optimized good. And if you don't optimize for what is good, then the only thing that's going to happen is you're going to have great fantasies that never come true. The opposite is also true with the functionality of the past. If you only do what worked in the past, you're never going to be able to innovate or account for new information. You're going to get stuck. You're going to stagnate. You're going to be lost in the desert, maybe for 40 years. And so this is the pattern of thinking that atheists constantly fall into, and it completely prevents them from being able to understand the Old Testament. So let's watch here what Alex did and see if we can't answer these questions maybe a little better in hindsight?
I have heard this response before, right? The idea is that there are two ways to look at this. One is to say, well, actually, God was perfectly okay with it, but it just wasn't as bad as you think. And one way is to say, actually, it is pretty bad, but God's not okay with it, right? For example, in the book of Exodus, where the law of God says if you have a Hebrew slave, he's to go free after 7 years. If he has a wife, when he comes to you, then the wife goes free too. But if, while he's your slave, he takes a wife and has children, the wife and children stay with you. They don't get to go with him. If, however, it says the man decides that he loves his wife and he loves his children and he loves his master, as if those three have to come together. Maybe he just loves his wife and kids. Well, he can stay with them, but in doing so, he's taken somewhere. He has his ear pierced like cattle, and then he remains a slave for life in order that he can be with his wife and children. Now, I understand the idea that maybe God, for some reason, couldn't abolish slavery. Maybe the society just couldn't do without it, whatever the reason may be. It seems to me that it wouldn't have been too much to ask for God to say, if he has a wife and children, then when he goes free, his wife and kids should go with him.
So, as we can see, Alex is, well, he's thinking in terms of the ideal. He takes the situation of slavery, and the situation of slavery, in the case of a slave owner who has a slave, and then allows that slave to get married, if the slave owner were to simply have to release the entire family with a single slave that gets out, a single male slave that gets free for whatever reason, as his contract runs out, the problem with that is that the marriage could have happened, months ago, and then all of a sudden the slave owner is out a slave. Now, it's hard to sympathize with slave owners, but at the same time, they are the ones in the legal right during periods that had legal slavery. And so if you were to undermine that and say, no, the entire family had to go, all you're doing is actually hurting the slave, because then the slave master is going to say, I'm not letting my slaves get married. That's a one-way ticket to losing a bunch of my slaves. Why would I do that? And so in order to facilitate the most good, the law has to account for that which allows for the most good to happen to the slave. Now, of course, you can always say, why do we have slavery at all? And that's because slavery is actually a moral step up from that which came before. Before slavery, the way of handling undesirables was execution. And execution, just killing somebody, is not as good as allowing them to live on the condition that they are watched and kept under guard so they can't do anything wrong. In ancient times, people were very poor. They did not have the money. They did not have the excess manpower. They could not just put someone in prison. They definitely couldn't rehabilitate them. If a thief came into the village and stole the entirety of the granary, that could cause the entire village to starve to death. You can't reasonably expect some, leader of a tribe to take that kind of risk for a complete stranger. That's a good way to get everyone killed. And then once you have no food, what are you going to do? Starve to death, or probably just go do war upon your neighbors, and then you become the undesirable thief who is going and trying to use violence in order to take what you don't have. And it's a spiral of violence. And so the best that can be done above execution in that time, the moral step up, was to enslave someone, to give them the option to work instead of die. And it's not a great choice, but that's the conditions they were in. And so, again, you can see how all these laws are meant to do the most good, the optimized good. Alex, on the other hand, wants to jump up to the high ideal. He wants to go right to the, why don't you just let the whole family go? And the answer is simply, you let the whole family go, no one's ever going to get married. You're never going to allow, slave masters are never going to allow slaves to get married ever again, because it's pointless. It's nothing but taking a huge risk upon themselves. And if the slave master is not a moral individual, I know it's a strange concept, a slave owner not being terribly moral, but they're going to do what's best for them. And unless you are going to completely wrench slavery out of their hands through some conflict or enforcement, something like the Civil War, then the best you can do otherwise is just to give them the incentive to allow their slaves to marry, because it actually gives them a chance to keep their slave. If the slave indeed loves his wife and is okay, and let's not say happy, but okay with his master and how he's treated. Again, this is just pay attention to that pattern that Alex is constantly falling into throughout these videos. He's falling into the temptation to go for the ideal at the cost of anything that can actually and reasonably do the most good. Anything he were to enforce would actually cause more harm than good. Alex then goes on to talk about the problem constantly talked about of women leading church services and preaching in the Bible. Let's listen real quick.
Which is 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 to 35, if you're following along at home. Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. If there is something they want to learn, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church.
So again, most people have problems with it because it falls short of the ideal. It's a moral maximizing method in the Bible. And how does it maximize morality? Women and men have proclivities, and these are naturally ingrained. Everyone's aware of them. They are not the difference in intelligence, not the difference in ability, but rather the difference in what is cared about as a base standard of where you start and then where you make your goals in order to get there. The difference between men and women is something of a feminine and masculine mindset. Now, of course, men can have feminine mindsets and women can have masculine mindsets, but there is a predisposition in each of the genders to feel that way. They naturally gravitate towards that in any given situation. They default to it without thinking, and only with thinking and effort can they overcome that and switch over to the other side, which is good. It's extremely good to understand both sides, but again, if you're in a church or a temple or any group and you're teaching morality, it has to be maximized, and the efficiency of the teaching is going to depend on who's teaching and their natural proclivities. There's no reason to take somebody who is biased towards one way of thinking that is dysfunctional for teaching and try to make them the ones teaching. Now, of course, morality has to be maximized, and that means whoever is best needs to be in that position. It doesn't really matter who it is, but the best one needs to be. And so, in the lack of any actual good teaching men, of course, a woman can step in, but if she cares about morality, she's going to desire anyone that's better than her. And so, same as men, every man will want to find someone who is better at preaching to fill that role to maximize the morality that comes from moral teachings. Now, the difference between men and women, and why this tends to be a general rule, is that the feminine mindset, often found in women, is a desire for beauty. Women are the purveyors of beauty, not because they're beautiful necessarily, but because they want idealism. And you can see the idealism that comes out in all forms of beauty. All beauty is extra. It's something that is not related to function. It goes beyond function. The best example would probably be a woman's touch making a house a home. What's the difference between a house and a home? Well, a home is pleasant to live in. It's got all these little frivolities. Now, does the building require nice curtains and pretty furniture and well-organized cutlery and utensils and a pleasant kitchen with a candelabra and just any little thing you can imagine that will make living in a house better, more pleasurable. It's all beauty. It's all extra. It's all an attempt to manifest something that doesn't necessarily work, but goes beyond what works and suggests something above, transcended. It leads you into the future. It's something more, something worth sacrificing for, because you are sacrificing, and the sacrifice is the functionality. Everyone knows that if you want to make a house a home, well, that's expensive. It's going to cost proportionally to how beautiful you make that house. Men, on the other side, happen to be more predisposed to masculine thinking, and masculine thinking inherently revolves around function. It is the here, it is the now, it is how do you make things work. Now that has to sacrifice beauty, because when you're getting down to business and trying to figure out what works here and now, you can't get lost in high ideal fantasies. Those fantasies are unrealized. If you allow those fantasies to slip into function, you destroy the function. You can see that in any masculine situation, perhaps the military going into a fight, they cannot stop and consider what would be pretty in the trenches, or how to make the military vehicles look nicer. It doesn't matter. You don't wear nice clothes. You wear camouflage because it's functional, because you might die, and the function is destroyed if you try to bring in beauty. It's nice. It would be nice. It's a wonderful fantasy, and in an ideal world, yeah, that's exactly how everything would work. It would be a beautiful war where no one has to die. You aim your weapon, and then the person says, "Oh, yep, you got me," and it's all a game. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful, peaceful world, but also a silly world, because it's clearly purely fantasy, and it's that focus on fantasy that can destroy functionality. So if we go back to preaching in the church or teaching people of morality, morality has to happen here and now. You can't get stuck in high ideal fantasies, because it destroys the function. And so Alex's criticism here is a function of that. He seems to want to say, hey, why don't we put some beauty into the church? And the reason is because there's a lot on the line. There's nothing more important than the spreading of moral understanding and the teaching of what works for morality. People are suffering. People are dying. If we're going to go out and help this world and make it better and make it transcendent, we have to figure out what works first. And only once everybody is comfortable with what works can we move on to making it even more beautiful, more optimized for transcendence, and to reach something that is fantasy now, but eventually might become reality. So if we were to put a woman up in the pulpit, it's not that she couldn't do the job. It's that if your highest goal is morality, then you're going to want that to be optimized. And so if you put a woman in the pulpit, she is going to bring with her her natural proclivity for beauty and idealism. And that fantasy, because it can't yet be realized, will tear down the function of current morality. Now, if you know anything about current morality in any sort of large societal group, it's tenuous at best. It's barely hanging on by a thread. To urge yet more unseen and unattained fantasy is to doom what function there currently is to being destroyed. And so it's not to say that a woman should never be in the pulpit. It's not a set-in-stone rule. It's a guidance that should be followed unless there's no other choice. If you have a man and he is masculinely predisposed to thinking in structure and function, he's going to do a good job of pushing the law without pushing too much beauty, because he's not going to be terribly interested in beauty. He's going to care about what actually works right now, and that's what you should want if you want maximum morality. Alex then goes on to talk about the genocides of the Old Testament, and he once again asks the question, why did it have to be done at all? Why not just not do it? And that's, again, his mindset of not optimizing morality. He wants to go to the high fantasy of morality. Let's listen here.
Do you think that this grace, this omnipotence, this love and charity of the Old Testament God is expressed in the instances where he commands the complete obliteration of entire nations of people, including the women and the children and even the animals, at multiple points throughout the history of the Israelites trying to conquer their holy land, which is promised to them by God, such that if anybody is already living there, they're driven out, and if they refuse to leave, they're chased out and they're killed, and then they come back and they kill the women and the children. Do you think that this is the same graceful, loving God that's issuing these commands?
So once again, Alex is going to the high moral ideal. He's saying, why does it need to happen at all? Whereas God is trying to maximize morality. He's doing this because the simple fact of the event at the time is not all that God is considering. God can see the future. He knows that by allowing the Israelites, or ordering the Israelites to go and wipe out all the Canaanites, he can put it in his scripture, and it can teach generations to come a very important lesson. So the context here is that the Canaanites were doing horrible, terrible things. They were sacrificing children. They were trying to eugenically create giants through ritualized interrelations. They were trying to bodily mutilate each other into a culture of power and greed and world domination. It was a completely worldly, horrible society, and in the sight of the Israelites, they were completely evil and too far gone to possibly redeem. So what you have is the Israelites. They're fresh out of Egypt. They took 40 years to get there. It purged all of their weakness. Now they're the chosen people of God. They believe themselves to be quite moral, quite high. And what's the first thing someone does as soon as they think that they have finally gotten good with morality and God? Well, they start judging others. And it's pretty easy to see how they could look at these Canaanites and then say, we will be the judge of God. We will judge in God's name and wipe out and destroy. And God said, all right, I can use this. It's not ideal, but it's the best you're going to do, and let me show you. And so he took the Israelites and he said, yes, go to them. They are evil, and if they are evil, wipe them out completely. That's what you do with evil. You don't spare a single thing of evil. So let's see if you can hold this ideal. And as Cliff points out later in the video, clearly the Israelites failed. These people did survive. The Israelites could not go into the land and could not slaughter every animal and every woman and every child and every man and leave nothing alive. They couldn't handle it, because who could? Who could go into a group of people and just, even the tiniest children, and even the ones who weren't being righteously minded, they wanted the plunder. They'd see these animals, which were very valuable, and they would say, I want this plunder. And they see the women, which were very desirable, and they'd say, I want to take these women. And God said, no, these are evil. Are they not? Remember, the Canaanites were doing these horrible, evil things, and if we're going to wipe them all out and remove the evil, then we have to indeed wipe them all out. You don't get to keep any little piece, and that's the temptation, to keep a small piece of the evil. Try to turn the evil to good. Try to spare the parts of the evil you like, to only cut away the evil that you yourself don't want to engage in. And so God said, let me show you that, first of all, you can't do this and are not actually worthy of purging evil off the world. And secondly, that you are going to be corrupted and your heart actually isn't in that good place. So you can't do it, and you didn't really want to do it from the beginning. Consider, after all, that God knew it would go into his scripture, and if he knew that, then he knew that we would read it for generations to come. because he set limits on war, defined what war had to be. It had to be ordained by God. It had to be a complete wipeout. You could not go in and just enjoy the spoils of plunder. Instead, you had to buckle down and do the perfect job of wiping out evil. So if you think you see evil in the world, it better be the type of evil that has to be wiped out completely. But who can look around and see pure evil? No one. No one can see a group of people that are just nothing but evil all the time. They're still children. They're still innocent and decent people among even the most evil groups. And so God can make that judgment. But we can't. How many wars did him setting that limit stop? How much good did it do? If it did enough good to justify the single genocide, then how could God not kill the Canaanites in that way? He was going to kill them anyway. We all die of some sort, old age or misfortune. It doesn't matter. God is going to end your life. And so when he chooses how to end your life, he does that which does the most good. So again, God is using the maximized moral action here of allowing the Israelites to do this, commanding that they try to do it perfectly, knowing they'll fail, showing us even to now that this is how this works. This is a fact of reality. You have to take the optimized moral ground, and the optimized is always the middle. It's never the ideal. You can't reach the ideal. You have to keep the ideal where it belongs, up in the sky, as an ideal. You aim for it, but you do not demand it in all things, or otherwise you're going to destroy all of your function. If God wanted to, he could easily have just wiped the Canaanites right out. There's nothing stopping him from using his powers to make them all just die instantly, or forcing them to walk into the ocean, or whatever way he wanted to get rid of them. But he didn't. He used a very methodical way, a specific way, a way that would show us today how morality actually works. And so again, Alex seems to be missing this every single time. He wants to jump to the moral ideal. This is the pattern I watched all through this video, and this is the pattern that I've just every atheist I've ever spoken to follows this exact pattern. They say, why would I follow the Bible if it's not morally idealized? And the reason is, you couldn't follow a scripture that was morally idealized. It would be too much for you. It would overwhelm you and destroy what little good can be done for us who have sinned. And so, hopefully throughout this video, and I encourage you to go watch the video yourself for sure on Alex's channel. Watch how he acts throughout the entire video, how he keeps his mind in the moral ideal in order to escape having to optimize morality. This is a constant atheist self-deception that I have to deal with, and I thought this video was the perfect example to point that out. It's just a universal pattern of how atheists seem to think. They just won't give that up, no matter how many times it's pointed out. So again, Alex, he seems like a very smart guy, a good guy. He cares, but he's falling into mental traps, and that's why I have to use that to try to point it out to anybody who's able to see the pattern, anybody with eyes to see. But hey, thanks for joining me. I hope you learned something about how morality has to work and the pitfalls that we can all fall into. If you got any thoughts, please leave a comment below, and be safe out there. God bless you.